A woman with serpents for hair, a monster whose eyes could turn a man to stone. Her name was Medusa, and we were told to fear her. But what if everything we think we know is wrong? What if Medusa wasn't a villain, but a victim? Not a beast, but a goddess. Not a warning, but a memory. Beneath the fangs and the fury there's something older. Older than Zeus, older than Athens, older than myth, because long before she was called monster, Medusa may have been something divine, and what was taken from her, what was silenced, still echoes through stone and through time. Today we're not just telling a legend, we're unravelling a 4,500-year-old secret. And once you see her face for what it truly is, you'll never be able to look away. They said she was a monster, the last of the Gorgons. Her hair, no longer strands but serpents. Her face so terrifying, so unnatural, that a single glance could shatter bone, turn flesh to stone. Even the bravest warriors were told, do not meet her eyes, do not enter her cave, do not speak her name. Her name was Medusa. According to legend, she lived far beyond the edge of the known world, on an island no sailor dared to chart. Some called it the ends of the earth, others whispered it was the threshold of the underworld itself. There, Medusa waited, alone, hidden in the shadows of jagged cliffs and black rock, and in those shadows men disappeared. She wasn't always like this. The oldest myths tell of a time before the curse, when Medusa was human, a priestess of Athena, beautiful, chaste, devoted. Her hair, they said, was her crowning glory, thick and dark as night, woven with scent and softness. Her eyes held no venom then, only light. But then came Poseidon, god of the sea, lord of earthquakes and salt and storms. And like the sea, he took what he wanted. One night, within the sacred walls of Athena's temple, Poseidon found Medusa. Some say he seduced her, others say he didn't ask. What happened inside that temple is written in riddles. The poets do not name it, but in the aftermath, Athena arrived, not to avenge Medusa, but to punish her. The victim was transformed, her beauty now a curse. Her hair turned to snakes, her eyes filled with death. The message was clear. From now on, anyone who dared look at Medusa would be petrified. She would carry her pain as armour, her face as a weapon. It was cast out, exiled to a barren island, alone except for the hiss of her hair and the silence of stone. But even in exile, the gods would not leave her alone. Years later, a hero arrived, sent not by fate but by command. Perseus, son of Zeus, champion of kings, was tasked with slaying the unkillable. He carried a polished shield, a sword from Hephaestus, and winged sandals from Hermes, but his true weapon was reflection. He crept into her cave, not looking at her directly, but only through the shield's mirrored shine. He struck, clean, swift. And just like that, the monster was no more. Her head, still alive, still potent, was taken as a prize. Perseus flew home, Medusa's severed face swinging from a sack. It was no ordinary trophy. Her gaze still held its power, even in death. He used it to turn his enemies to stone, to silence beasts, to conquer kings. Eventually the head of Medusa was gifted to Athena herself, and in an act of strange reverence the goddess mounted it on her shield, the aegis. The face that had once been cursed was now divine again, feared, respected, worn in war. It was a strange reward for a woman exiled and executed. But this is the tale we were given. A monster punished for her beauty, a hero praised for her murder, a goddess who turned pain into power, but only after removing the woman who bore it. And we've told this story for thousands of years, whispered it into bedtime tales, painted it on urns and shields, etched it into marble and bronze. But if you look closely, donkeys, the cracks begin to show, because something in this myth doesn't sit right. A woman punished for being defiled, a monster slain in her sleep, a severed head turned into a sacred relic. It feels less like mythology, and more like memory. A memory buried so deep in time we've forgotten it was ever real. A warning distorted into a bedtime story. A goddess carved into a monster. But if we go back far enough, before the marble, before the myth, before the gods of Olympus, we may find a different Medusa, one not born in horror, but in reverence, not feared, but worshipped. And maybe, just maybe, the real monster isn't the one we've been told to hate. The first time Medusa appears in recorded history, she isn't even a woman. In Hesiod's Theogony, written around 700 BCE, she's simply one of 3 Gorgons, sisters born of ancient sea gods, creatures of chaos and dread, their names, Stheno, Uraeal and Medusa. Unlike her immortal sisters, Medusa is the only one who can die. Already something is off. Why make one mortal? Why single her out? The Theogony tells us that when Perseus beheaded Medusa, the winged horse Pegasus sprang from her neck. So did Chrysaor, the golden giant. They were not monsters. They were miracles, divine offspring, born not in life but in death. And yet no reason is given for her death, no origin, no sin. She simply exists to be destroyed. Later, the Roman poet Ovid filled in the blanks. His Metamorphoses, written in 8 CE, would shape Medusa's story for centuries. He added the detail that Medusa was once a beautiful maiden, that her hair, those infamous snakes, had once been flowing locks admired by many. And he added one more thing, the temple. It was Athena's temple, he wrote, where Poseidon raped Medusa. And it was Athena, outraged by the desecration of her sacred space, who punished the girl. She transformed her into the very monster that we remember. Not because of guilt, but because of violation. Not to protect Medusa, but to purge the shame from her temple. This version of the tale was elegant, poetic, tragic. But it raised more questions than it answered. Why was the victim punished? Why was the god excused? Why was the transformation treated not as trauma, but as horror? For centuries no one questioned it. The myth passed through the mouths of poets, the hands of sculptors, the pens of scholars. Medusa's head became a decorative motif on shields, on coins, on walls. Her image was both feared and revered. But always, she was alone, separated from her story. Her severed head became more important than her living face, because that's what myths do. They preserve what a culture wants to remember and bury what it wants to forget. When we read Ovid or Hesiod today, we're not reading neutral stories. We're reading decisions, choices made by men shaped by politics, fear and power. We're reading the end of something older. You see, Medusa's story didn't begin in Latin verse or on Greek pottery. Her myth was not invented in stone temples or scrolls of parchment. She came from before, from an age without alphabets, from the breath of women who told stories by firelight, from goddesses who ruled not from thrones, but from caves, rivers, and soil. The classical texts, the ones we quote, memorize, and venerate, are only the tip of something buried much deeper. And beneath those written words is a Srunhits, a deliberate absence, because somewhere between the oral and the written, Medusa stopped being sacred and became dangerous. Her power stopped being divine and became monstrous. She was no longer a guardian, she became a warning, and in doing so something ancient was severed, just like her head. So now we ask, what came before the Gorgon? Before the mirror shield, the sword, the winged sandals? Who was Medusa before the myth was written? To answer that, we must dig deeper, through clay tablets, through ritual symbols, through forgotten names carved into stone. We must step off the marble paths of Olympus and wander into darker places, older places, because Medusa may be the echo of something the Greeks tried to forget. And what they feared, they turned into a monster. Her eyes are wide, not with terror, not with grief, but with fury. Her mouth is frozen mid-scream, lips parted, teeth bared, caught in a silent roar that never ends. Her face is not passive, it does not plead, it does not ask for mercy. It is rage, pure, ancient, undiluted. The image of Medusa's face has haunted Western memory for thousands of years. We see it in sculpture, in bronze, in black and red pottery. We see it on doors, on coins, on shields. Always the same stare, always the same snarl. But what most don't realize is that for centuries, this face wasn't meant to be feared. It was meant to protect. In Greek, it's called the Gorgonian, the mask or face of the Gorgon. Long before she was a figure of myth, Medusa's image was used as an apotropaic symbol, something designed to ward off evil, a spiritual barrier, a warning not to proceed. It adorned the armour of warriors, the pediments of temples, even the breastplate of Athena herself. Her face was never hidden. It was displayed boldly, defiantly, and not because she was hated, but because she was powerful. To the ancient world there was no contradiction between fear and reverence. A deity could be terrifying and still be divine. In fact, the power to frighten away darkness, to paralyze the evil eye, was seen as sacred. The Gorgonian wasn't Medusa's curse, it was her crown. So what happened? How did an image of divine protection become the face of a monster slain? It begins with transformation, one of myth's oldest weapons. You don't need to destroy a goddess to erase her, you just need to change the story. In early depictions, Medusa is monstrous but not animalistic. Her features are fierce but humanoid. Over time, the snakes become more exaggerated. Her teeth more jagged, her eyes more demonic. She loses her voice. She becomes pure symbol, rage without origin, danger without cause. Her face becomes an emblem, not of divine wrath, but of uncontrolled femininity. A woman too angry, too wild, too powerful to be tamed. And in patriarchal mythologies, that is the ultimate threat. Because Medusa doesn't seduce, she doesn't beg. She looks back. She dares to meet your gaze. She dares to exist on her own terms. In many ways, her face was never about horror. It was about defiance. The Gorgon's scream is the sound of boundaries breaking. It is the noise made when a woman refuses to be silent. And for some, that sound was unbearable. So they changed her. They made her a creature to be slain, not understood. A beast, not a being. A curse, not a consequence. And yet, her image remained. Even as the myth distorted her, the symbol refused to die. Even in temples that told of her fall, her face watched from the heights, etched in marble, cast in bronze, fused into walls. She remained unblinking, watching over cities and shrines, as if some part of the world still remembered, still feared, still honoured what she had once been. Because deep beneath the story told by heroes and poets, there is another version of Medusa. A version where her rage was not shameful but sacred. Where her scream was not weakness, but warning. Where her stare was not fatal, but protective. And perhaps that's why her face survived, long after her name was smeared. Because even when they called her monster, they couldn't look away. Even in fear they knew her rage meant something. Before Perseus, before Athena, before the Olympians cast their shadows across myth and memory, there were other gods, and they did not live on mountaintops. They lived in caves, in rivers, in stone. Before there were temples of marble, there were shrines of earth. Before the gods wore togas, they wore the body of woman. And long before Medusa was called a monster, she may have been called a goddess. In the Bronze Age, nearly 4,500 years ago, the island of Crete flourished with a civilization we call Minoan. It left no epic poems, no conquest myths, no tales of war-hungry gods. What it left behind were symbols. Frescoes of women in elaborate skirts and bare chests. Serpents coiled around their arms, cradled in their palms, eyes wide, staring, not with malice, but with mystery. These weren't monsters, they were priestesses, or queens, or deities. The Sake Goddess, as archaeologists call her, appears again and again in Minoan artifacts, often standing tall, unafraid, holding serpents with quiet command. Some figurines date to 1600 BCE. That's 1,000 years before Hesiod ever wrote Medusa's name. What do these images tell us? That snakes, once feared in later stories, were once sacred. That the feminine body, once seen as sinful, was once revered. That power and womanhood were not at odds, but intertwined. And it wasn't just Crete. In ancient Sumer, one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, a deity called Ningish-Zida was depicted with serpents rising from his shoulders, a god of the underworld, healing and transformation. In Egypt, the cobra goddess Wadjet wore the serpent as her crown. Her gaze protected pharaohs. Her wrath punished invaders. She was the eye that saw all. Her symbol? A serpent rearing, ready to strike, placed on every royal brow. In Catalhoyuk, a Neolithic site in modern-day Turkey dating back to 7500 BCE, clay figures of powerful seated women surrounded by wild beasts were unearthed. One sits between two leopards. Another gives birth while holding a serpent. None of them hide their gaze. These weren't monsters, they were guardians. They were mothers. They were rulers of life and death. What do they all have in common? Wide eyes, serpents, power. And perhaps that's no coincidence, because as patriarchal cultures expanded, often through war, conquest and colonization, these feminine deities began to change. They were not erased outright. They were recast, from protectors into temptresses, from mothers into monsters, from symbols of life into omens of death. It is a pattern we see again and again. Lamia, once a Libyan queen, transformed into a child-eating demon. Lilith, a Mesopotamian spirit, became the first woman to defy man and was condemned. And Medusa, who once may have stood watchfully with snakes in hand, became the hunted. This shift didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, across centuries, through myth, through metaphor, through silence. But even as their names were darkened, their faces survived, carved into the temples, etched into bone, whispered through stories that refused to die. They lived on, not as gods, but as ghosts. So when we look at Medusa today, when we trace the outline of her screaming mouth, her unblinking eyes, her crown of serpents, we're not just seeing a monster, we may be seeing the last breath of a lost world, a world where power wore a woman's face. And the serpent was a symbol of life, not a weapon of shame. To erase a god, you don't need fire, you need a new story, one where the goddess becomes the beast, one where the shrine becomes the lair, one where the protector becomes the punishment. And that is what happened to Medusa. As the Olympian pantheon rose to power, the world of the divine began to shift. The old gods of earth, sky, and serpent were no longer enough. A new order was taking shape, a patriarchal order, one ruled by sky fathers and storm gods, Zeus, Poseidon, Apollo. And in this order, there was little room for female power that did not submit. So the ancient goddesses, those who birthed life, ruled death, and held serpents in their hands, were rewritten. Not into history, but into myth. Not into memory, but into cautionary tales. They were too powerful, too untamed, too sacred. So they became dangerous. Consider Lamia. In one version, she was a beautiful queen of Libya, beloved by Zeus. But when Hera discovered the affair, she cursed Lamia, turning her into a serpent-bodied demon who devoured children in the night. Her punishment? Eternal wakefulness, eternal loss, a maternal figure shattered into monstrosity, or Echidna, half woman, half snake, the mother of monsters in Greek myth. She births the worst creatures of Olympus, not because she chooses to, but because her womb was rebranded as chaos itself. Even Hecate, goddess of witchcraft and the crossroads, was eventually marginalized, relegated to twilight and shadow, her torches no longer lighting the world but warning before it. And then there was Medusa. She too bore the marks of an older power, a woman tied to serpents, to stone, to gaze, but her destruction was unique, because it came not through curse, but through narrative. In earlier art she was fierce, yes, but also symmetrical, regal, controlled. Her eyes met yours not in hatred, but with warning. Her face was centered, framed, revered. But slowly, across the centuries, her image fractured. The snakes grew longer, her mouth widened, her eyes twisted with madness. She became the embodiment of unacceptable female rage. And her story? It was sanitized for masculine triumph. No longer a priestess, no longer a protector, no longer a woman at all. She was something to be conquered, a beast to prove a hero's worth. Even Athena, herself a goddess, joined in the undoing. Her wrath became the engine of Medusa's transformation. Her shield bore the head as a weapon. It was as if the Olympians knew, if you cannot contain the old goddess, weaponize her, use her, mount her image on war, and call it divine. And so the feminine divine was fractured, split between virgin goddesses who served the state like Athena and Artemis, and monstrous women cast into the wilderness, Medusa, Lamia, Scylla, Circe, either obedient or obliterated. And for thousands of years that false binary held. But somewhere beneath the marble columns and the victory hymns, a different voice still whispers, a voice that remembers Medusa not as a monster, but as a guardian, as a priestess, as a goddess. Not because we see it in the texts, but because we see it in the cracks, in the symbols that refuse to die, in the eyes still etched into stone, in the serpents still coiled at the feet of forgotten temples, because not all gods are erased by fire. Some are buried, and some are still waiting to be remembered. They say she turned men to stone, not with a sword, not with poison, but with a look. That was her curse, they said, her gaze. A glance, and you were frozen, paralyzed, stripped of breath, stripped of life. But ask yourself, is that truly a curse? Or is it a metaphor. Because in myth, and in life, there is nothing more terrifying to a certain kind of man than a woman who looks back. For thousands of years, the gaze of a woman has been policed, controlled, redirected downward. To look directly, to stare openly, to confront was dangerous, improper, unfeminine. It challenged the order of things. And Medusa did not look away. She met the hero's eyes. She met the gods. She looked back, and they turned her into a weapon. In the psychoanalytic tradition, scholars have long read Medusa as the embodiment of repressed fear, particularly the male fear of feminine power. In 1922, Sigmund Freud wrote about Medusa's head as a symbol of castration anxiety, a projection of male dread at the sight of uncontrolled female sexuality. For Freud, the snakes were phallic, the gaze emasculating. Medusa was not just terrifying, she was paralyzing. But perhaps there's another reading, a deeper one, a more ancient one. Carl Jung might have called her the shadow, the part of the psyche that contains everything a culture denies, represses, or false fears. For patriarchal systems, that shadow was feminine power, autonomy, rage. Medusa, then, becomes the shadow cast by centuries of silencing. She is the face that cannot be unseen, the scream that cannot be stopped, the stare that cannot be broken. And what does her gaze do? It turns men into stone, cold, hard, silent. Stone, the foundation of temples, tombs, thrones. Medusa doesn't kill, she halts, she confronts, she exposes. She is not the assassin, she is the mirror. And that may be the most terrifying power of all, because in her myth the hero does not defeat her face to face. He dares not look her in the eye. Perseus uses a polished shield, a reflection. He sees her only indirectly through her glass and steel. He wins, not through courage, but through distance. And isn't that fitting? Even in her death, Medusa could not be faced. Even as her head was severed, her eyes remained open. They would haunt battlefields, petrify enemies, guard goddesses. No man could look at her directly, not without being changed, not without being broken, and perhaps that is the real fear. Not that her gaze was fatal, but that it saw too much. It saw what men wanted to hide. It saw the truth beneath the armour, the myth, the title. It saw them unguarded, naked, small. And maybe that's why they called it a curse, because to be seen fully, to be seen by a power you cannot control, cannot possess, cannot seduce, that is a threat no sword can defend against. So they silenced her, they blamed her, they cut off her head, but they could not close her eyes. And that is what still terrifies them. Snakes writhe across her scalp. They hiss, they coil, they strike, they terrify. But why? Why are snakes always the villains in our stories? In the myth of Medusa, the snakes are a curse, a punishment, a visual marker of her fall from grace. But this was not always so. Long before they slithered through Eden, long before they tempted saints or turned goddesses into monsters, snakes were sacred. In the ancient world, serpents symbolized life, not death. In Sumer, one of the first civilizations to rise along the Tigris and Euphrates, the snake was tied to the god Ningish-Zida, a deity of fertility, healing, and the underworld. He guarded the gates of the afterlife, his form coiled with twin serpents. In Egypt, the cobra goddess Wadjet was one of the most revered protectors of royalty. Her hooded form crowned the pharaoh's brow, a living flame that spat poison at his enemies. She did not symbolize evil. She symbolized sovereignty. In the Indus Valley, in India, in Africa, across countless cultures, the snake is not an enemy. It is a guide, a guardian, a being of cycles, of shedding skin, of death followed by rebirth. Even in the Greek world, the god of medicine, Asclepius, carried a rod entwined with a serpent. Not a sword, not a shield, a snake, to heal, to transform, to restore. So when we see the snakes atop Medusa's head, what are we really seeing? Are they fangs and fear? Or are they fragments of something older? A crown, a halo, a memory? Because the snakes may not mark her as cursed, they may mark her as chosen, as a vessel of wisdom, as a symbol of sacred knowledge that cannot be tamed. And what of stone? In the myth, her gaze turns men to stone. Cold, dead, immobile. But stone is not death. Stone is memory. We carve names into stone to keep them alive. We build shrines and tombs and temples from it, so that they will outlast us. Stone is not absence, it is permanence. To be turned to stone then may not be an ending, it may be a kind of revelation, to be seen so fully that your illusion dies, to be brought face to face with truth, with power, with the ancient divine, and to freeze, not from fear, but from awe. And maybe that's what Perseus feared. Not Medusa's cruelty, but her clarity, her power to stop him, not through violence, but through vision. In that sense, Medusa is not the bringer of death. She is the bringer of stillness, the end of illusion, the halting of forward motion, the moment when you must look at yourself and not look away. In that frozen gaze, you see what was always there, the lies of the hero, the silence of the gods, the rewriting of the past. So yes, Medusa's head is ringed with snakes, her eyes unblinking, her mouth open in warning. But none of this is evil, unless you fear the things they represent. Feminine wisdom, rebirth, truth. They called her cursed, but maybe she was only crowned, with symbols they could no longer understand. She was hunted, she was cursed, she was decapitated by a boy hero sent by kings and gods, and yet her head became holy. After Perseus beheaded Medusa, he did not bury her. He did not cast her into the sea, he carried her, like a weapon, like a prize, and she still worked. Her severed head retained its power. With it he turned sea monsters to stone, turned rival kings to ash, cleared his path through myth and memory, and when his journey ended, he gifted her head to Athena, the very goddess said to have cursed her in the first place. And Athena took it. She didn't reject it, she didn't burn it, she mounted it on her shield. The aegis, famed in myth, feared in war, was adorned with the Gorgonean, the face of Medusa, still snarling, still watching, still warning. The gods had no use for her body, but they could not let go of her power. They killed the woman, but they kept the weapon. And this is the great hypocrisy of the myth. The thing they feared, they now claimed. The symbol they demonized, they now exalted. They wore her, held her up, sent her into battle to protect their own. But ask yourself, what does it mean when a severed head becomes a shield? It means something once feared has become useful. It means the sacred has been stolen. It means power has been taken from the source and wielded by those who silenced it. In ancient art, Medusa's head was placed over thresholds, on walls, on coins, on armour, not to curse but to guard. The very gaze once called destructive became protective. And in that inversion lies the truth, because deep down they knew Medusa was never evil. They knew her image held ancient strength, so ancient it could not be ignored. So they took it, cut it from her, and used it for themselves. This pattern is not unique to Medusa. It is the history of conquest, of empire, of patriarchal gods absorbing the symbols of the goddesses they overthrew. Over and over again, the same story unfolds. Burn the witch, keep her spell, kill the prophetess, quote her words, behead the goddess, mount her on your shield. They didn't destroy Medusa, they rebranded her, weaponized her, turned her from a symbol of divine feminine power into a tool of war. But a symbol cannot be tamed forever. Even as she rode into battle, strapped to the arms of gods, her eyes still looked out, still saw, still remembered. She was no longer a woman, no longer a voice, just a mask, a face, but even that was enough. Enough to survive, enough to whisper through stone, enough to remind us of what was taken and what still lingers. Because deep down, Athena didn't wear the head of a monster. She wore the head of a sister, a rival, a goddess. And maybe, just maybe, she knew it. She no longer has a voice. She is only a face now, a mask frozen in time, a weapon carried into battle, a symbol detached from its source. But symbols remember. Even when stories are rewritten, even when meaning is buried, something remains, a trace, a resonance, a shape left in the dust, and Medusa's shape is everywhere, in stone carvings above temple doors, in mosaic floors meant to guard against evil, on the breastplates of warriors long dead, in the nightmares of men and the dreams of those who refuse to look away. Because despite everything, despite the myth, the murder, the severing, her image endured. Why? Why did we keep the face of the one we called monster? Why did we not turn away? Perhaps because something deep inside us remembers remembers a time when power wore a woman's face, when wisdom spoke in riddles and riddles were sacred, when serpents meant rebirth, not sin, when the gaze was not a curse, but communion. What if Medusa is not just a character, but a memory of what was lost when the gods changed, a memory of what was silenced when myth became law, a memory of the divine feminine, broken and buried, but not forgotten. Across cultures, fragments of her linger. In India, the goddess Kali wears a necklace of skulls and a gaze that terrifies even demons. In Mesopotamia, Inanna descends into the underworld and returns with power no man can steal. In African cosmologies, serpentine spirits like Mamiwata guard knowledge and water alike. And in each of them we see a glimpse of something Medusa once was, not a monster, but a threshold, a doorway between life and death, between terror and truth, between the stories we were told and the ones we forgot. To stand before Medusa is not to face evil. It is to face everything we've tried to suppress. Shame, rage, power, voice. It is to be seen and to see, to witness the cost of erasure. Because in every myth lies a message, not always in what is said, but in what was taken out. And Medusa's myth is full of absences. The absence of her voice, the absence of her side of the story, the absence of what she was before the sword, before the temple, before the label. But what if that's the point? What if Medusa was never meant to be understood, only feared? Never meant to be worshipped, only wielded? What if her silence isn't just the result of death, but the design of those who feared her life? And what if, somewhere beneath that silence and something still that speaks, not in words, but in symbols, in snakes, in stone, in stares that do not blink, because memory is not always passed down in stories. Sometimes it survives in resistance, in persistence, in the image that refuses to disappear, no matter how many times we try to slay it. And maybe that's why her face remains, not to curse us, but to remind us that what we call myth might be a distorted map, a crooked reflection of a truth too powerful to name, and beneath the mask, beneath the horror, beneath the centuries of fear, there is a woman, there is a goddess, there is a memory waiting to return. They cut off her head, mounted it on a shield, raised it in battle, held it high, claimed it as their own, but they never closed her eyes. Even in death she sees, through bronze and marble, through myths and mosaics, through every story that called her monster and every silence that erased her name. Medusa still looks back, not with rage, not with problème, but with memory. She sees what was taken. She sees what we forgot. She sees what we've become, and maybe that's why we fear her. Not because of what she is, but because of what she forces us to see. That history is not as clean as we think. That myths are not just fantasies, but weapons. That gods are not always just. That heroes are not always good. And that sometimes the monster is the one holding the sword. To look into Medusa's eyes is to see the cost of forgetting, the price of denouncing, the power of what we were told to fear. It is to face what was buried, and to ask, why was it buried? Because the feminine divine still lingers, just beneath the surface, in the stories we half remember, in the symbols we wear without knowing, in the fears we carry but cannot name. Medusa was not the end. She was a threshold, a gate, a guardian, a voice that refused to stay silent, even in silence. She is the scream beneath the stone, the rage beneath the myth, the truth beneath the mask. And when we stop looking away, when we dare to meet her eyes, not with fear but with understanding of soul, we don't turn to stone, we begin to remember, because perhaps she was never meant to be slain. Perhaps she was meant to be heard. We think of Medusa as a tale from long ago, one of gods, monsters and myth. But the truth is, she never left us. She lives in the things we fear without reason, in the women we silence, in the questions we refuse to ask. And maybe that's why her eyes were never shut, because she's still waiting, waiting for us to see her, not as a creature to kill, but as a story to finish, a voice to restore, a goddess to remember. She still looks back, and now we finally look back too.